As the saying goes, an airplane that lands is not news. But what about the thousands of structures in Houston, Florida, and the Caribbean islands that withstood hurricane-force winds? Are they news? One journalist believes the media is entirely too focused on destruction as opposed to what survived.
There's no question that recent weeks have seen a fury of horrendous natural disasters.
Overnight, the island of Puerto Rico submerged after receiving more than 30 inches of rain.
And of course, reporters focus on the human angle, people who have lost everything.
We waded through chest-deep water to help get through their back window. It's worse than they feared.
But writing for the Columbia Journalism Review, journalist Adam Ragusia says, TV hurricane coverage failed my family. Writing, his family evacuated their home in the lower Florida Keys before Hurricane Irma hit. But as they stayed glued to their TVs, they couldn't find a single reference to neighborhoods that were spared, only ones that were destroyed.
We did the interview right here. That was the bar. But it's all gone. It's all gone.
Ragusia singles out this CNN Bill Weir report, calling it ridiculous because, in fact, the bar was not all gone, and many buildings were still standing in the background. Well, kinda. Anyway, Ragusia says good news has a bad reputation in the news business. That's true. But let's face it, what he's really upset about is that CNN didn't tell him the family home was still standing.
Quite honestly, if he hadn't made this quite so personal, I think he makes a good point. But he was upset, as understandably so, that he wasn't hearing about his neighborhood, his parents' neighborhood. And, you know, it's like, what's the weather? People want to know what's outside right here, right now. They don't want to know some generic weather forecast. They want to know, is it raining out right now? Can I go play tennis? But he does make a good point about focusing on the negative. I can remember being at ABC, and there was massive flooding in the Midwest, and we drove around for a long time trying to find a flooded parking lot that we could stand in to do stand-ups. I mean, it wasn't that there wasn't flooding, but you wanted something that was ultra-dramatic. These storms, however, seem to me to have gotten the proper amount of attention. I mean, this really was almost total annihilation, at least in some of those small islands.
I do think, I mean, you make a good point, because I look back to some times where we would go, if something was happening in Sacramento, for example, I can tell you right now there are two places that will flood no matter what happens, right? Yeah. And that's where you go. And part of it is that, you know, in order to really have this narrative of things are bad, you have to show an example of something that is going, that there's water has come up in a certain area. I think there is a responsibility, though, for us to say, you know, here's what's happening here. What's amazing, though, is that there are these neighborhoods over here that are still standing. You know, that even though the storm, we do this with tornadoes sometimes. We'll point out how, in tornado coverage, a tornado comes and it skips over a house, and you'll show one that's standing. But I agree with you. This sounds like it's more of a personal thing. And there's no way that a reporter can go and give everyone an update on their property.
You know, I think that he makes a valid point when he complains about the lack of focus on places that are standing. What I don't know is how many reports actually did say, we have a whole neighborhood over there which is still intact. He didn't provide a kind of a content analysis. So his argument in theory is a good one. In practice, I'm not sure how often people deviated from what he wants them to do. Suggesting that it was inappropriate to say that the bar was all gone because there was rubble and it wasn't all gone, there was rubble visible. That was a little cute. The best point he made, I think, is when he noted that CNN then went and took the report of the bar being all gone and turned it to a web headline that said Key Largo is all gone. That is really problematic. And
that was an exaggeration.
Yeah, that's exaggerated. Right.
Well, there was a time when we thought that there would be a hyperlocal blogger for every block, and then we would have been able to get house by house reports. That didn't happen. You know, I take your observations. I think you're all right, but you know there is an element of storm porn when something like this happens. I mean, the cable stations just go wall to wall, and you could almost sense a palpable sense of disappointment when Hurricane Irma, which caused a tremendous amount of damage, nevertheless did not come roaring up the coast with quite as much wind power and as had originally been projected. And it's because they weren't able to give the viewers back home quite as much damage as they were hoping for.
Wow.
Well, I have to say, I watched quite a lot of coverage, and I did see people say, "Isn't this amazing?
Yeah.
Houses are still standing. This neighborhood was untouched." Now, if he's talking about the ratio, of course, it was way off. It was all disaster, because there's a lot of horribleness, to your point. I mean, this was pretty dramatic. But I did hear some of that, so I want to put that on the table, that some reporters did point that out. It wasn't that they were looking at structure standing and ignoring saying that. In fact, some of them said it's kind of impossible to think about. The wind came here and whipped this off, and yet this building right next to it is still standing. So I did see that. I take his point, and we can always get better balance. I do think that nobody, including us who are not there on the ground, can give the full horror of it like those reporters who are there, because it is beyond what we have seen and reported about.
I agree.
So we got to, put that in context as well.